Hands up, buddy! This isn't your neighborhood, barked a voice, piercing the evening silence like an icy blade. Antonio, lost in thoughts of homey comfort and the smell of dinner that should have been waiting for him, didn't even have time to lift his head. The shrill wail of sirens, sharp as a blade, tore through the remnants of tranquility that had enveloped him like a soft blanket. A police car, black and shiny, screeched to a halt a few meters away, its tires shrieking on the hot asphalt, leaving behind an acrid trail of burnt rubber. Two officers, young, strong, and full of energy, jumped out of the car. Their eyes, cold and piercing like those of predators, instantly locked onto him, penetrating him through and through. The best part is coming up next. Leave a comment telling us which city or country you're listening from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for your support. Enjoy listening. Hands up, buddy, this isn't your neighborhood, repeated the same voice, belonging to a tall officer with a square jaw that seemed chiseled from stone and a mocking tone that promised nothing good. His words, like a whip crack, echoed down the quiet street, drawing the attention of the few passers-by. Antonio felt his heart constrict. It was a familiar sensation. He remembered how once when he was just 17, he was stopped at the corner of the street while returning from the library. The officer searched his backpack, dumping all his textbooks onto the dirty sidewalk, laughing at his attempts to explain that he was just studying. That cold fear, that humiliation of having to prove your innocence just to exist, all of it washed over him again. But now, he was a different person. He was a federal judge, a man who administered justice. And yet, that old ingrained fear returned for a moment. Only later, when his hands were already on the cool, shiny hood of a gray BMW, and the cold metallic handcuffs clamped around his wrists with a characteristic click, did Antonio truly realize what had happened. It was only now, through the haze of shock, that he heard the carefree laughter of children on the playground, who continued their games, unaware of what was wrong with the uncle in the wrinkled shirt. Their bright voices, full of joy, seemed a dissonance against the backdrop of what was happening. It was only now that he remembered the message from his only daughter, Clara, which he had not had time to read. "Dad, are you coming soon? My unicorn is almost ready." This message, full of childlike innocence and anticipation, pierced his heart with a sharp pain, making him realize the absurdity and injustice of the situation. He was surrounded in mere seconds. The air around him thickened, filled with the smell of ozone after the sudden breaking and a faint, barely perceptible scent of the officer's sweat mixed with their cologne. Antonio slowly raised his hands. His gaze was calm, almost analytical, as if he were assessing the situation rather than being its victim. He saw in the officer's eyes not just suspicion, but something deeper, a deeply ingrained prejudice that seemed to be etched on their faces, as if engraved by time. This was the very prejudice he had fought against all his life, and which, to his bitter surprise, had now turned against him. "This car is mine," Antonio said quietly. He felt his words, simple and truthful, crash against an invisible yet impenetrable wall of their bias. For the police, his words only heightened their suspicions. They roughly shoved him against the car, the handcuffs clicked shut with a metallic snap, and they dragged him toward the patrol car. Antonio felt the cold metal on his wrists, but his face remained impassive. He knew that the main thing now was to stay calm. Every nerve in his body was taut like a string. Some passers-by watched silently, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment, while others pulled out their phones to record the incident, as if it were just another show. "Another thief caught," someone in the crowd muttered, and those words, like sharp shards, pierced Antonio's soul. He heard it, and a wave of bitterness surged within him, burning like acid. He, a man who dedicated his life to justice, had now become a victim of unjust judgment. The officer, noticing that he was being filmed, smirked, his lips stretching into a cruel grin, and loudly declared for all to hear, "If you're going to steal, at least learn to look rich." A harsh, humiliating laughter erupted in the air, seemingly directed at him personally. This laughter etched itself into Antonio's memory like a brand. 20 years, Antonio thought, echoing in his mind. 20 years I built my reputation, fought for justice in the courtroom, handed down verdicts, defended the innocent. And now, one glance, one wrinkled shirt, and I'm once again that same kid who gets stopped on the street for no reason. My robe, my authority, all of it vanished in the blink of an eye. They see not a judge, but a stereotype, a set of prejudices they've conjured up themselves. He felt anger rising within him, but he suppressed it, knowing it wouldn't help now. The holding cell smelled of sweat, rusted metal, and something indefinably sour. An old creaky fan lazily spun on the ceiling, producing a monotonous, irritating sound. In the back of the room, Lieutenant Almeida, a veteran with a furrowed brow etched with deep wrinkles and zero patience, observed the proceedings from his swivel chair. His face was carved from stone, reflecting years of service filled with cynicism and fatigue. Almeida had once believed in justice, in ideals, but years of routine, endless cases, and constant encounters with human depravity had made him callous and indifferent. He remembered how his wife once told him that he had changed, that his eyes had lost their spark, and that had crushed him. He saw in every detainee merely another number in a report, another problem to be quickly solved, stealing his precious time. "Another one for attempted robbery?" Almeida asked, not lifting his eyes from the paperwork. "Yes, sir. He says the car is his, but he has no documents with him," replied one of the agents, the one with the square jaw, suppressing a smile. "And the accent?" Almeida inquired, finally looking up. "Latin American, very pronounced," the agent responded, with barely concealed disdain in his voice. The lieutenant raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smirk. "So he's probably lying." There was not a shadow of doubt in his voice, only a firmly held belief. Antonio, still in handcuffs, was seated on a chair opposite them. No one offered him water, no one explained his rights. Just suspicious glances that seemed to pierce into his very soul, trying to find confirmation of their biased judgments. Antonio felt his dignity slowly but surely being trampled. "Name?" the lieutenant commanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Antonio Herrera," Antonio replied. A storm brewed inside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He felt as if his pride, his years of hard work, his status, all of it was being wiped away in one fell swoop. He recalled the words of his mentor, old Judge Ricardo. "In the courtroom, your main weapon is your calmness and your logic. Emotions are the enemy." He clung to those words like a lifeline. "Profession?" Almeida continued, a clear mockery in his voice. "Federal judge?" Antonio answered. He watched the officers' reactions as if studying them in court, analyzing every movement, every nervous tick. Laughter erupted in the room. One of the policemen, the same one who had dropped a coffee cup that shattered loudly on the floor, exclaimed, "This guy must be smoking something!" The laughter intensified. Some officers even doubled over with their hands on their bellies. Almeida smiled, but not from amusement, rather from disdain. "You, a federal judge? Look at how you're dressed. And what are you doing in this neighborhood, buying a yacht?" Laughter filled the air again, this time even more cruel, more humiliating. Antonio felt a wave of rage rise within him. He remembered how, as a child, at just 10 years old, his father, a simple worker, was unjustly fired due to the bias of his boss. Back then, he was too small to do anything, but he vowed to himself that he would never allow injustice to prevail. Now, sitting in handcuffs, he felt the same powerless rage, but this time he had the tools to fight. "I need to make a call. It's my right," Antonio insisted, his voice becoming slightly firmer. Lieutenant Almeida waved him off without looking up. "This isn't a court, Mr. Judge. We're in charge here." His voice was full of undisguised authority. Antonio slowly leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Almeida, piercing him through. "Lieutenant, I understand you are following protocol, but I also know that protocol requires identification verification. You haven't offered me water, you haven't explained my rights, and you haven't even bothered to look at my driver's license, which, by the way, is in my wallet in the back pocket of my pants." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I am ready to cooperate, but I insist on my rights being respected. It's in your best interest." Almeida raised his eyes, irritation evident in his gaze. "Don't teach us how to do our job, buddy. We know what we're doing." "Maybe you do," Antonio replied calmly, "but right now you are violating several federal laws. And believe me, I know what I'm talking about." He allowed those words to linger in the air like an invisible threat. The room grew quieter, laughter faded, and only the hum of the fan broke the oppressive silence. Antonio remained silent, observing every movement, every word of the officers. Not out of fear, but out of strategy. He knew that every minute spent without being heard played to his advantage. He was a judge, and he understood how legal processes worked, how evidence was gathered, how a case was built. He knew that their mistakes, their biases, their procedural violations would become his main arguments. He was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment arrived. When he saw the officer rummaging through his backpack without permission, pulling out his notebook and carelessly tossing it onto the table, something changed in his gaze. His eyes, previously calm, flashed with a cold, steely glint. This was not just a notebook. It was his working tool, containing confidential information on ongoing cases. This was a gross violation that could not be forgiven. "This notebook contains confidential court information," Antonio said in a firm voice, not raising his tone but with an authority that could not be ignored. His voice resonated in the silence of the room like the strike of a hammer. Lieutenant Almeida looked up, awkwardly taken aback by this unexpected assertiveness. He hadn't anticipated such firmness from someone he had just humiliated. "Now you believe in your little fairy tale, huh? What else do you have there? A robe?" Almeida muttered, trying to regain control of the situation, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. It carried notes of doubt. Antonio crossed his legs, still in handcuffs, and looked straight into the lieutenant's eyes. His gaze was piercing, as if he could see right through him. "When was the last time you checked the identity of a detainee before mocking him?" he asked. Silence. For the first time, sarcasm hung in the air. The tone was no longer that of a victim begging for mercy. It was the tone of someone taking control of the situation, someone going on the offensive. One of the young officers, Juan, the one who had been next to Almeida, hesitated. He was a rookie, still not fully hardened, and his conscience seemed to be awakening. Doubt flickered in his eyes, and his face paled. "Lieutenant, maybe we should check if he's telling the truth," Juan quietly suggested, his voice barely audible. But Almeida scorched him with a glare full of rage. "And what if we believe him, and he turns out to be a delusional con artist? You won't be the one to make me look like a fool in front of the commander." His voice was full of rage, but it already carried notes of fear. Antonio took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He knew that now was the time to deliver the decisive blow. 5 minutes, he thought. That should be enough for them to realize what awaits them. I am not just threatening, I am warning, and I know that they fear the consequences more than admitting their mistake. "You have exactly 5 minutes to check my name," Antonio said, his voice clear and measured, like a metronome counting down the last seconds. "If after that you continue to deny me my rights, you will become subjects of a federal lawsuit, not for bias but for willful negligence. I, Federal Judge Antonio Herrera, guarantee you this." The laughter ceased completely. Glances began to cross among the officers, filled with anxiety and fear. This phrase, federal lawsuit, carried a different weight coming from this man. It did not sound like an empty threat. It sounded like a clock that had just begun its countdown. And for the first time, they began to feel that perhaps, just perhaps, they had misjudged their opponent. The tension hung in the air. Each officer felt the icy chill of fear penetrating to their bones. The young officer, Juan, who had previously been doubtful, was the first to move. His face was pale, his hands slightly trembling. He approached the computer with some trepidation and began typing the name, Antonio Herrera. He pressed enter. The seconds dragged on, as if the silence weighed tons, and every heartbeat echoed in the room. Results began to appear on the screen. At first, nothing seemed important, but suddenly one line of text made his face pale even more, and his eyes widen in horror. Lieutenant, there is an Antonio Herrera registered as a federal judge, appointed to the Central District. The same name, the date of birth matches the photo too, Juan whispered, his voice barely audible. Almeida abruptly stood up from his chair, knocking it over with a crash. What did you say? He barked, his eyes wide with terror and his face distorted with panic. The young man turned the monitor, and there it was, a photo of Antonio, dressed in a black robe, taking an oath before the court. The same firm yet serene smile, the same penetrating gaze. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the fan, which now seemed deafening. No, this can't be, Almeida thought feverishly, his brain working at full capacity. This is some mistake, a coincidence. He can't be a judge. My career, all 30 years of service, everything I've built. His face contorted with inner conflict, the realization that his world was collapsing. This proves nothing. It could be a coincidence, a common name, he mumbled, but his voice trembled, betraying the panic that had overtaken him. Antonio did not flinch. He watched his panic with cold calculation. In the side pocket of my backpack, there is a credit card with a hologram and my court building pass. Why don't you check them? He suggested. Another, more experienced officer slowly retrieved them. His hands shook as he verified their authenticity. After checking, the tension turned into panic. It's authentic, Lieutenant, and he has federal access, he said, his voice filled with horror and his eyes wide. One of the most mocking officers, the one who had laughed the loudest, leaned against the wall as if he were short of breath. His face was ashen gray and his breathing was erratic. But he was in a BMW. Wasn't it stolen? He mumbled, trying to find some sort of hook. Antonio smiled for the first time, but it was not a cheerful smile. It was a smile of superiority. You can check the registration, my name is there. The numbers are updated. And if you look at the mall cameras, you will see that I entered through the main entrance greeting the doorman, who, by the way, knows me, and even joked with him about football. Each phrase was yet another stone falling on the tower of prejudice they had built, dismantling it to its very foundation. He was no longer just another detainee. He was a man with irrefutable evidence, with solid arguments, with undeniable authority. And the most destructive part, every mistake they made was recorded, and it was only a matter of time before it surfaced. We're in very deep trouble, one of the officers muttered, his voice filled with despair as his shoulders slumped. As the atmosphere heated up, one of the agents, visibly nervous, recalled something. What about the body camera, Lieutenant? It wasn't active during the arrest, he said quietly, his voice trembling. Almeida frowned, his eyes darting around, trying to find a way out. There's no need to check that now, he snapped, trying to brush it off. But it was already too late. The young officer, Juan, the one who felt a pang of conscience, stepped forward. His heart raced like crazy, but he knew this was his only chance to do the right thing, even if it cost him his career. He connected the camera to the system. Juan, what are you doing? Almeida hissed, his eyes narrowing. We have to do this, Lieutenant. It's protocol, Juan replied, his voice shaking, but he stood his ground. He pressed the button. The screen displayed the arrest footage with clear audio. There was a slight crackle, then the officer's voice, distorted by the speaker but clear enough. All the sarcastic comments, mockery, laughter were there, and most seriously, the exact moment when one of the officers opened Antonio's backpack without orders or consent. "This is a search without probable cause," Antonio muttered as everyone watched, now no longer hiding their discomfort. Their faces were filled with shame and horror. The air was thick with a palpable fear. The video also showed something none of them had noticed. Antonio's watch, an exclusive model with a personalized engraving on the back. "Thank you for your justice, Dad, Clara." A gift from his daughter, an invaluable symbol of their bond. Something that no sane person would steal or keep with such emotional detail. The final blow came when the same video captured a witness trying to approach during the arrest. A man in private security uniform could be heard saying, "He's a client of the building, he has a key card," but his voice was ignored. He was literally pushed away. "And why wasn't this witness mentioned in the report?" Antonio asked, no longer raising his voice, but his words sounded like a verdict that could not be overturned. No one answered. The police exchanged glances as if they were standing on thin ice that was about to crack. Lieutenant Almeida tried to close the video window, but young Officer Juan stopped him. "We can't hide this. It's already in the system. And if he files a complaint, the first thing they'll check will be this file," Juan said, his voice as firm as steel. Antonio slowly stood up, still in handcuffs. "Do you still think the problem is with me?" he asked, looking in turn at those who had humiliated him. His gaze was filled not with anger, but with deep disappointment that seemed to penetrate to the very soul. And at that moment, fear shifted direction. It moved from Antonio to those who had detained him. Antonio stood tall. He was no longer a detainee, no longer a suspect. He was a man who, with each passing second, was reclaiming not only his freedom, but also his dignity. The silence in the room weighed heavier than any sentence. They all knew they had crossed a line, but no one dared to say it out loud. "Do you know what's the saddest part?" Antonio began in a clear voice that seemed to penetrate to the very soul. He paused, allowing his words to settle in the air like dust. "It's not that I was handcuffed without evidence, not that you laughed at my accent or my clothes. It's that it no longer surprises me. The realization that if I didn't have this position, if I weren't a federal judge, I would be sitting in a cell right now, waiting for a call that might never come, is truly devastating. My story is just one of thousands, perhaps millions of cases where innocent people suffer due to others' prejudices and systemic blindness. I have seen this in my court countless times, but I never thought I would find myself on the other side of the bars. And the most frightening thing is that you, the people tasked with upholding the law, have become part of this blindness." The officers lowered their gazes. Some pretended to read documents, others simply swallowed hard, their faces pale. Almeida, broken, his shoulders slumped, looked as if the whole world had collapsed on him. "What have I done?" Almeida's thoughts raced like cornered animals. 30 years of service, all for this? My wife has stopped talking to me, my children avoid my gaze. I always justified myself by saying the system is such that there's no other way, but he showed that it can be different. He showed that I was just a coward. I have become what I once despised. And how many more like that are out there? How many have been detained because of how they look, how they speak because they cannot defend themselves with titles and badges? Antonio turned to everyone. "You made a mistake today not because you didn't know who I was. You made a mistake because you didn't care to know. Because you decided, as you do every day, that with certain faces there's no need to check anything. You saw not a person but a set of stereotypes." One of the senior agents mumbled, his voice full of justification. "We were just following protocols." Antonio looked at him firmly. "Protocols do not humiliate. People do that when they decide how to apply them. Protocols are tools, but in the hands of those who blindly follow prejudices, they become weapons. And today you used them as weapons." Then he headed for the exit, still in handcuffs. A young officer, Juan, the one who had turned on the camera, approached and with trembling hands removed them. "I'm sorry, Mr. Herrera," Juan whispered. His eyes filled with genuine remorse, and his face expressed deep pain. Antonio did not respond, only looked him in the eyes, not with hatred, but with deep disappointment. And in that gesture was the true verdict that left a deep, indelible mark on the young officer's soul. After the handcuffs were removed, Antonio felt the blood rush back to his wrists. He rubbed them, trying to shake off the feeling of cold and pressure. He exited the precinct, and the fresh night air felt like the cleanest and freest thing he had ever breathed. But this freedom was bitter. His BMW awaited him, seeming to be the only witness to his humiliation. He got behind the wheel, and his hands, which had just been restrained, gripped the steering wheel tightly. He started the engine, and the sound, usually so familiar, now seemed deafening. He drove home in complete silence, his thoughts flitting about like butterflies in a closed jar. At home, Clara was already asleep. He peeked into her room. The small figure, peacefully sleeping under the blanket, seemed such a fragile miracle. He adjusted the blanket that had slipped and gently kissed her on the forehead. Her innocent face, her calm breathing, that was the only thing that gave him strength, an anchor in the raging sea of injustice. He thought about how her purity contrasted with the filth he had just experienced. How could he protect her from a world that so easily judges by appearance? He felt tired, but it was not the kind of tired that comes after a long workday. It was the fatigue of injustice, of struggle, of realizing how fragile justice is in this world. He lay down in bed, but sleep eluded him. Images of the police, their mockery, Almeida's laughter, all of it swirled in his head, refusing to let him rest. He spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, reflecting on what had happened and what he needed to do. On an ordinary Sunday, a few days after the incident, Antonio was walking in a park near his home. He was dressed, as always, simply. Old jeans, a wrinkled shirt, and a leather backpack slung over his shoulder. His engraved watch gleamed on his wrist. Clara was running a few meters ahead, playing with other children, her laughter echoing through the park, filling the air with joy. The sun was gently setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the world seemed momentarily in balance, as if all problems had vanished. A middle-aged woman with a weary but hopeful face timidly approached him. Her eyes were red from tears, but there was a spark of determination in them that seemed capable of melting ice. She recognized him. "You're the judge from the video, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. Antonio nodded with a gentle smile that seemed to calm her. She lowered her gaze, anxious, fiddling with the edges of her bag. "I just wanted to say thank you. My son was arrested many years ago for something he didn't do, but no one listened to him. When I saw your story, I felt that someone was truly speaking for us, for those who have no voice." Her voice broke, and she took a deep breath, trying to hold back tears. "My son, Andres, was only 19. A talented guy, he dreamed of becoming an engineer. He was accused of a robbery he didn't commit. The police, they just didn't want to listen. He's been in prison for 3 years now. His story is so similar to yours, but with a tragic outcome. You were heard because you are a judge, but no one listened to my son." Antonio took her hand respectfully. His touch was warm and soothing. "Now we are being heard because you also spoke up, sharing your story. Every such story, every attempt to be heard creates a wave of change. Your courage will inspire others." He returned home, but he could no longer feel joy. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "You were heard because you are a judge, but no one listened to my son." He recalled his own experiences, the humiliation, the fear. His personal victory, which had seemed so significant, now felt incomplete, unfinished. He felt a responsibility for those who could not speak for themselves, who had been crushed by the system he had sworn to protect. Clara noticed that her father was troubled. She approached him, her small hand resting on his knee as if trying to comfort him. "Dad, did you help that woman?" Clara asked, her eyes full of a childlike wisdom that seemed to penetrate to the very soul. Antonio took a deep breath. "I just started, my dear. Her son, Andres, is unjustly in prison. His story is very similar to mine, but he hasn't been as lucky as I have. I have to help him, so his story doesn't repeat itself, so he isn't broken. Clara hugged him tightly. I know you can do it, Dad. You're a judge. This conversation laid the groundwork for Antonio's next step. He realized that his struggle was not over. It was just beginning. He felt that his life had taken on a new meaning, a new direction. Antonio didn't sleep all night. He sat in his office surrounded by law books that seemed to watch him from the shelves. He read about Andres' case, every word, every letter. He requested all documents, interrogation protocols, surveillance footage. He began his own investigation, using the connections and knowledge he had acquired over 20 years of service. He felt like a detective searching for the truth in a labyrinth of lies. The first steps were difficult, as if he were navigating through thick fog. He reviewed old police reports, which contained numerous inconsistencies. Witness testimonies were contradictory, and the evidence seemed hastily gathered, as if someone wanted to close the case quickly. He could smell the bias that permeated every page, every line. He turned to his fellow judges but was met with bureaucracy and skepticism, as if he had encountered an invisible wall. Antonio, you're a federal judge. We don't interfere in police matters. That's not our job, said one of his old acquaintances, Judge Martin, stroking his gray beard, which seemed to symbolize his conservatism. The case is already closed, and no one wants to reopen it. It could set a precedent that we don't need. Set a precedent for justice? Antonio replied, his voice as cold as ice. Isn't that why we're here? Isn't that the point of our work? The police hierarchy, trying to avoid a new scandal after the incident involving Antonio, obstructed his investigation. He was denied access to certain documents, citing confidentiality and the ongoing investigation. This created a new, more serious conflict that seemed poised to engulf him. Antonio felt as if the system was trying to suffocate his initiative, like a giant octopus. But Antonio was unyielding. He knew he needed an ally from within, and he found one. The very young officer, Juan, who had assisted him at the precinct, was now working in the Human Rights Department. Inspired by Antonio's actions, Juan secretly passed him internal documents and information that could help with the case. Mr. Herrera, I can't risk my career, but I believe in what you're doing, Juan said over the phone, his voice tense and breath quickening. I found something in the archives that might be useful. Surveillance footage from another store near the crime scene. The police ignored it. Antonio felt a surge of hope, like a breath of fresh air. It was a lead. He spent sleepless nights studying the footage, frame by frame, as if trying to find a needle in a haystack. He zoomed in, slowed down the playback, until he noticed it. In the footage, the criminal was seen limping slightly on his right leg, barely noticeable but consistent. Andres, as he discovered from his medical records, had never limped. It was a tiny but undeniable detail. Then, while reviewing footage from another camera located at the street corner, he noticed that the criminal wore an unusual jacket with a bright logo of a local baseball club, which Andres, a die-hard soccer fan, would never wear. These two details seemed to scream Andres' innocence. Antonio gathered all the evidence, meticulously building his defense like an architect constructing an impregnable fortress. He succeeded in getting Andres' case reopened. This was unprecedented. It hadn't happened in decades. He took it upon himself to be his lawyer, using his authority and reputation to draw public attention to the case. News of the new hearing spread quickly, attracting journalists and human rights advocates from across the state. The courtroom was packed. The air was electric with anticipation, as if before a storm. Andres' family sat in the front row, their faces filled with hope and fear, their eyes fixed on Antonio. Andres, pale, but with a glimmer of hope in his eyes, sat next to Antonio, his hands trembling. Andres' mother took his hands in hers, as if afraid he would disappear again, while his father, a sturdy man who usually showed no emotion, quietly wiped away tears. Antonio began his presentation calmly, but his voice sounded firm and confident, as if he were delivering a verdict. He didn't just use legal arguments, he told a story. He spoke of the systemic biases that led to this tragedy. He showed the video footage that proved Andres' innocence, pointing out the criminal's limp and his jacket. He presented the testimonies of new witnesses who confirmed his alibi. This young man, Andres, was convicted not for a crime, but for how he looked for his background, Antonio said, his voice trembling with emotion but remaining as firm as a rock. He became a victim of the same blindness that I faced myself, but unlike me, he had no voice. He had no title to make himself heard, and that is why I am here. To be his voice. To show that justice should not depend on skin color or social status. The prosecutor, an elderly man with a weary appearance, attempted to interrupt him. Your Honor, the defense is straying from the essence of the case. Not at all, Your Honor, Antonio replied, turning to the judge. The essence of this case is precisely the bias that led to the unjust accusation. I am showing how easily the system can err when it is guided by prejudice rather than facts. The judge, who had been listening attentively, nodded. Continue, Mr. Herrera. Antonio continued, speaking about the pain of Andres' family, the lost years of his life, the shattered dreams. The courtroom was completely silent. The judge overseeing the case listened intently, his face serious, his eyes fixed on Antonio. Journalists feverishly recorded every word. The jurors, many of whom were elderly, listened carefully, their faces expressing sympathy and outrage. Some nodded their heads, while others frowned, realizing the weight of the error. At that moment, in the back row, sat Lieutenant Almeida. His face was ashen gray, and his gaze was locked on Antonio. Every word spoken by the judge struck him like a hammer on an anvil. He saw his cynicism crumbling, his own blindness laid bare. He recalled the words of his wife, who had told him years ago, "You have changed, Robert. Your eyes have dimmed." Back then he had brushed it off, but now he understood that she was right. He saw himself in the mirror, a weary, embittered man who had lost faith in justice. He felt shame burning within him, and he wanted to disappear, to dissolve into thin air. The resolution came swiftly. The evidence was irrefutable. Antonio secured an acquittal for Andres. It was not just a legal victory, but a symbolic one. It showed that the system could change, that even the deepest prejudices could be overcome. Andres walked free. His mother rushed to him, embracing him tightly, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks and laughter mingling with sobs. My boy," she whispered. Andres smiled genuinely for the first time in 3 years. Antonio met them. In their eyes, he saw not just gratitude but hope. Hope that justice is possible, that the world can be better. Antonio returned home late at night after court. Clara was already asleep, and he quietly peeked into her room. The small figure, peacefully sleeping under the blanket, still seemed to him a fragile miracle. He adjusted the slipped blanket and gently kissed her forehead. Her innocent face and calm breathing once again became his anchor in the turbulent sea of injustice, the only thing that gave him strength. He thought again about how her purity contrasts with the dirt he had experienced and how he could protect her from a world that so easily judges by appearances. But this time he felt not the previous bitter fatigue, but a pleasant exhaustion from a job well done, from the realization that he had been able to change someone's life. In the morning at breakfast, Clara, finishing her toast with jam, asked, "Daddy, did you help that man?" Antonio smiled. "Yes, my dear. Andres is now free, and I must help many more. There are still many Andreses who need a voice." Clara, sitting at the table, began to draw. First, she drew a large, beautiful unicorn, and then, next to it, a figure of a man in a flowing cloak with a firm but kind face. It was her dad. As for Lieutenant Almeida, his career, as Antonio had predicted, collapsed. An internal investigation, initiated after the incident with the judge, revealed numerous violations. He was suspended from service and subsequently fired. His wife, who had long distanced herself from him, filed for divorce. Almeida, broken and lonely, tried to find solace in alcohol, but each sip only intensified his shame and regret. He became a living reminder of how easily one can lose oneself by succumbing to cynicism and prejudice. Juan, a young officer who showed courage, on the contrary, began his path to change. He remained in the Human Rights Department and became actively involved in reforms. He had to face resistance from the old guard, mockery and sabotage, but he did not give up. He became the voice for those within the system who wanted change, and his career, slowly but surely, began to rise, becoming a symbol of hope for transformation. The final scene: Antonio sits in his office. On his desk lies a stack of new cases that have been handed to him, reports on unjustly detained individuals, letters from families asking for help. He looks at them, and there is no fatigue in his eyes, only determination. The first letter is from an elderly woman whose grandson was detained for simply standing at a bus stop in an inappropriate area, waiting for a bus. The second is from a man who lost his job due to a false accusation based on rumors. The third is from a mother whose son was sentenced to a long term for a minor crime committed by his friend, but due to the lack of a good lawyer and the bias of the system, all the blame fell on him. Antonio realizes that this is his new mission, his true calling. His personal struggle has turned into something much greater. He has become a symbol of hope, a voice for those who were invisible. And he was ready to continue this fight step by step, case by case, to make the world a little fairer.